Welcome to the Unlist. Today, I'd like to have a discussion about leather fragrances, or leather as a subject, I guess you could say. So, leather fragrances might seem like a no-brainer. It's a scent that's trying to capture the smell of leather. And there are some folks out there who absolutely love leather in all of its forms. And there are some folks who just smell one example and go, that's it. I don't want to I don't like leather perfumes. Get them out of my face. Leather is kind of a love it or shove it genre. At least I don't find anyone who's ambivalent about leather or kind of goes, I like some but not others. Most people are either crazy for leather in a fragrance or just want no parts of it. So that right there kind of sets the stage a little bit about our discussion concerning leather. And the thing about leather is leather as a fragrance subject, leather as a note found in more complex fragrances that are not necessarily all about leather. If you follow it back historically, it all stems from the fact that leather making itself was sort of an adjacent science to perfume making. Not all leather makers were perfumers or vice versa, but a lot of perfumery, at least centuries ago, came from leather makers because it's an adjacent science. Like I said, whether you want to say chemistry or alchemy, went by different words, combining materials together, creating essences from nature, creating man-made substances. These sort of things kind of go together, because leather makers are making a man-made substance. They're taking an animal hide and then they are curing it and creating something that can be used for clothing, for saddles, for a number of other purposes. So it kind of makes sense. They're handling chemicals and materials and things distilled from natural ingredients, birch tar, castoreum, stuff like that, to create leathers, to tan the leathers. So therefore, a person like that would have some knowledge in mixing materials together so they could also, They could make a perfume too, correct? Yeah, they can mix oils together. Like I said, these things kind of go hand in hand. It's no different really than how a lot of barbers were also perfume makers, because again, perfumery is a cosmetic thing and you're already getting your hair cut, or you're already someone who's learning how to cut hair, how to trim hair, how to condition it, different things. So it makes sense that you would want a product that smells good to put on the customer whose hair is being cut or trimmed. So you sort of learn how to mix the essences together because you're already using different materials to condition the hair, to cut it to begin with. You also see that with apothecaries, druggists, what they used to call chemists, people who create medications, who distill materials to take orally for health reasons. They too also can become perfumers. So you see a lot of these different trades that involve the creation of materials, or the combining of materials. Perfumery becomes like, a cross skill, or like if you're going to use Dungeons and Dragons terms, like if you're multi-classing, you're a fighter, but you're also a rogue. So it's like you're a leather maker, but you also make perfumes. You're a chemist, but you also make perfumes. You're a candle maker, but you also make perfumes. You see where I'm going with this? So therefore, leather as a subject for fragrances was almost inevitable. It was inevitable in the same way that a lot of fragrances also have cosmetic and hair care crossover. A lot of fragrances sort of evolved out of making other products for the skin, for the hair. And it's just the way it works, guys. So the thing about leather as a subject, leather as a genre of fragrance, if you will, it's a fantasy note. It's an abstract thing. It's no different than the fougere or the sheep. The only difference is whereas the fougere and the sheep ended up with like an orthodox way of making them, there's a very prescribed methodology for fougere. You can toy with it and you can alter it, and that's where you get the aromatic fougere and the fresh fougere and yada, yada, yada. The sheep is no different. You've got the aldehyde ones, you've got the fruity floral ones, you've got the citrus aromatic ones, But with leather, there was never really an orthodoxy. There was really no recipe. This is the one way to build a leather accord. So that lack of orthodoxy, that lack of methodology, is what has made leather fragrances throughout the past, say, 100 to 150 years so varied in texture, so different from one another. And see, that is also why, unlike the fougere, unlike the sheep, which you can trace back using like an ancestral tree, sort of like, you can go all the way back to fougere royale or all the way back to sheep de Côte. You can't really do that with leather perfumes. There's not really like an origin of the species for leather perfumes. There's not the leather fragrance. There just isn't. And that's because without a methodology to follow, without an orthodoxy to adhere to, without dogma, if you will, people are kind of left to their own devices. Create a leather fragrance in whatever manner you deem fit until it smells close enough to leather in your mind's eye. If you see it as leather, it's leather. So that's why I very, very strongly advise people who are curious about leather as a subject, who don't really have an opinion yet, but they want to form one. Whether, if you're not one of the love it or shove it people, you just don't know, I strongly recommend you not to just smell one or two from a specific time period or a specific price point or a specific location in the world, because there is no methodology. There effectively there are no rules. There is no wrong or right here. So you have to kind of do a little more. You have to have a little more due diligence before you can create an informed opinion about leather. Whereas with fougères, you're like, okay, I'll smell Fougere Royale. Okay, I'll smell Dracar Noir. Okay, I'll smell Mont Blanc Legend. Okay, I'll smell Pasha or Jazz, right? You smell 6 of those, Simopaca, Rabanne, Azzaro. You're like, okay, I know what fougères are now. I'm good. Sheeps are the same way. Let me smell number 5. Let me smell Mitsoku. Let me smell, Poison, which is kind of an Oriental crossover. But you get my point. You smell like a certain number of garden varieties, Arpège. You can even go as modern as something like C by Emporio Armani. You smell a bunch of those, and you're like, okay, I know what a sheep is. I'm good. Leather, that's not as easy. Leather, it's not that cut and dry. You just can't have a little Whitman sampler pack of leather fragrances that are all available commercially somewhere and go, okay, I know what leather's about. There's just, because there is no rhyme or reason, there are just too many different ways to approach the problem. There's too many vectors. And thus, the video I'm making now for you to watch is going to probably help eliminate a lot of the guesswork. It's not perfect, okay? I'm not setting up a rule for you to follow here. Don't get that twisted. But I'm trying to do a Reader's Digest condensed book version of how to leather, right? So the thing you need to know is, if you approach the more antiquated leather fragrances, if we're going back to like Santa Maria Novella, and we're going to smell Peau d'Espagne, okay? We're going to smell something like Clear de Russie in its many formats. Very popular, by the way. It was almost a genre for a while in and of itself. The Clear de Russie genre, or the Russian leather genre, very, very popular genre from the late 19th century into probably the mid 20th century. The most famous examples are going to come from the big houses. I think one of the few surviving, because a lot of these are gone now, one of the few surviving examples would be Chanel's take on Clear de Russie, which came out in like 24, I think, or 25. Could be wrong. Could be a little newer than that. But that particular kind of leather, Clear de Russie, is based mostly around birch tar. It's very heavy on birch tar because Russian leather, Clear de Russie, was created with birch tar. Russian leather, in its traditional form, is cured with birch tar. That's how you get the darkish, reddish, heavy brown look to the Russian leather. Now, the other way you could approach it, which is how the Santa Maria Novella approached it, which that's from the early 20th century, like 1905, I think, that was castoreum, which castoreum is another material that is used to cure and create leather. In fact, castoreum was also used in foods. There are certain candies, certain ancient types of candy that were used, even like as recently as the early to mid 20th century, certain bubble gums even contained it. I mean, I can't imagine what that would taste like, but Castoreum was a very highly exploited material, and one of the ways it was used is in the creation of leather. So these kind of leather fragrances, whether we're talking the birch tar or the castoreum, they're going to be a lot heavier, possibly more animalic, possibly smokier, okay? They're not going to smell pleasant, so to speak, because they're trying to really go for the natural style of creating leather before all the hides and all the chemicals that we now use to create leather with, right? And the modern leather, like the Wilson leather stuff, the Timberland boots, that stuff's not using birch tar or castoreum anymore. That's using chemicals. So those kind of leather perfumes would come into being as well, but we wouldn't see those until probably the early 20s and 30s, when perfume chemistry began to go, hey, let's do this modern tannery style leather, okay? So the modern tannery leather, those are going to be your Neat Satan, your English leather, your Aramis by Estee Lauder, your Cabochard by Parfum Gray, that sort of deal. And those are going to have the really bright aldehydes that kind of sting the nostrils, and that's how they approach it. They also have oak moss, and they have other materials. Some of them may have castoreum too, and some of them may have birch tar too, but they're not required in this case. One material you will find in these brighter, more nostril-burning leathers is isobutylquinoline, which isobutylquinoline is a very sour material, which kind of goes hand in hand with the aldehydes. Usually we're talking like allopathic aldehydes. So I forget which one that is, a C5, I think. C5 or C6, but the really Chanel number 5 style of aldehydes, the real like, right, comes up and just smacks you in the face, like it feels like you got champagne bubbles in your nose. So those kind of go with the isobutylquinoline and create that sour, tannery, you know, fresh out of the leather shop kind of leather, which is going to be different than your smokier, more resinous, more animalic, funky, you know, musky style, Clé de Rossi style leather fragrances. Now, there was a little blip in history when we would see green notes also put into leather fragrances. Fragrances like Bandit by Robert Piget, Germaine Cellier composition, by the way. Fragrances like, another one would be Miss Dior, the original Miss Dior by Christian Dior. There would be a men's version of that way later called Jules. I mean, it's not based on the Miss Dior formula, but it's a similar green aromatic leather. And those also use the isobutylquinoline as well. They may actually use it as part of the bigger Mousse de Saxe accord. And the Mousse de Saxe is not necessarily a leather material, but it's a compound that has isobutylquinoline, oak moss, anisic alcohol, and a couple of other things to create this just sort of mossy, dank base, which can support a number of perfume genres. It can support the sheep, it can support the leather, do, right? All these things sort of connect the dots, la la la. Now, once we get into more recent times, out of the 50s and 60s and 70s, leather fragrances start getting a little more weird. You know, especially in the 80s, man, people were like doing different things with leather. They were sort of doing leather, what I call leather plus, where it's leather plus something else, not strictly leather. The earliest example of those being those green leathers from the 40s and 50s and 60s that I was telling you about. But we would start to see a continued evolution of that. Like we would see stuff like Yatagan, very green arboreal leather fragrance from the mid-70s, okay? We would see more floral leathers or tobacco leathers, things like Avon Olan from 1970, Etienne Agenais from like 76, Giacomo Osendre from I think 71. Don't quote me on that. Dunhill Blend 30 from like 78, I believe, as well. These are what I call leather plus because they have a leather foundation, but then they've got other stuff on top, whether it's florals, whether it's green notes, whether it's fruity notes even. There are actually fruity leathers, okay? Like Maxim's Pour Homme from 87 is a fruity leather. We would see rose leather become a very, very popular combination into the 80s. Earliest examples of the rose leather We would see stuff like Ungaro by a Diva by Ungaro. I had it twisted there, I had it backwards, sorry. I had to do a strike that, reverse it, but Diva by Emmanuel Ungaro, which was a rosy leather fragrance. We would see Montana Parfum de Peau is another rosy animalic leather fragrance. You know, that's just something that kind of came and went with the 80s, okay? And then, of course, one of the biggest ones that guys like, especially in the online fragrance community, was Antaeus. Antaeus soapy green floral leather fragrance with a nice beeswax note. We would see Bogart would create One Man Show, which is another very heavy green. A lot of jasmine, surprisingly jasmine in that. It's a weird, One Man Show is a strange leather. It's got your leather, your castoreum, your musk, but then it's got a strange kind of jasmine thing in the middle, which is it's easy to miss. But once you find it and you isolate, like that's kind of weird. What's jasmine doing in another fragrance? But it's there. Trust me, it's there. Into the 2000s, we would see leather fragrances kind of also get redefined a little bit. Like I said, tobacco and leather pair together really well. So we would see stuff like the fruity plum tobacco leather thing that Michael Kors would put out, Harry Fremont composition. I believe it was 2001. So, you know, plum, tobacco, leather. Has the sour isobutylquinoline in there, but it also has a nice plum note. And then it has a tobacco note. Very interesting, very unusual. Wasn't a big commercial success. That's discontinued now, but it was another like abstract leather. Then we would also see people doing like what I would call softer kind of nubuck suede style leather. And these are created with a number of different chemicals. The nubuck suede, softer, kinder, gentler kind of leather. Different from the real spicy nostril burn. Okay, so leather fragrances for a long time were not really super pleasant. I mean, you smell Eau de Hermes, it's very funky, dirty. You smell Yatagan, very funky, dirty. You smell even Fahrenheit, released in 1988 by Christian Dior. That has just gasoline notes out the waz. I mean, it's got vanilla and stuff too, but just the gasoline notes, because kind of, right in the face. But once we start getting into the 21st century, the leather started to get softer and more supple, and they would achieve this with new synthetic materials. Surprise, surprise. This whole video has been about how the leather fragrance genre has no rules and therefore it has no anchorage. Without any anchorage, you can kind of do what you want. So we would see softer, more supple, a lot of cashmeran, which is a certain musky material, kind of furry a little bit, cashmeran-based leather fragrances, and then the suederol is another note that's designed to specifically duplicate the smell of suede. So cashmeran, suederol. Isoe Super would find its way into that mix because, of course, it would. It finds its way. Isoe Super is just kind of like MSG. It finds its way into everything. So, and then in the most recent developments we have nowadays are going to be what I call your shiny black boot leathers. These are ultra photorealistic leather fragrances that use basically state-of-the-art materials. I don't know what materials they are. I don't know the names, but I'm sure my perfumer friends can name drop them for me in the comments or come at me later and tell me off to the side. But we're talking all that like post Tom Ford stuff. We would start seeing it mostly in the mainstream section with Tom Ford, with stuff like Tuscan leather and later on ombre leather. And people jokingly refer to these as raspberry leathers because a lot of them do have a framboinon note mixed in there, which is a raspberry type of a berry note. But you have to understand that they're not trying to smell like raspberry. They're just using this material to round it off. Because if you notice, black leather, like, you know, harness straps if you're into BDSM, or like jack boots or whatever, they're not sharp smelling, are they? Black, shiny leather is not sharp smelling. It's very deep smelling, very rich. So that raspberry note, that framboinon, kind of achieves that. It kind of keeps it strong and leathery, but kind of rounds it off. So it smells like a pair of Doc Martens. right out of the box. Okay, it's designed to smell like that. And fragrances like Tuscan leather and Godolphin and La Yacawarma by Versace and Ombre leather. These fragrances, or like Dark Rebel Rider by John Bravados, all of these try to create that realistic photo accurate, black leather smell. Not everyone's going to like that, okay? But it's become very popular, and you see it a lot. And that's kind of where the state of the art for leather fragrances today, it's where it kind of exists. And don't get me wrong, niche brands and artisanal brands still play around with the older styles of leather. I mean, I'm wearing a fragrance right now with castoreum in it, so I know they still do it because this is not an old fragrance. But I can name drop some houses, but there are a lot of houses that actually still play with these. They're doing the isobutylquinoline, or they're doing the castoreum and birch tar, or they're doing something along those lines, right? Keeping the older styles of leather alive. So they're out there, of course. And the vintage examples, the older fragrances I mentioned, like Bandy, Cabochard, all that stuff, English leather, Nietzsche 10, all of those are still out there too. Sometimes you got to buy older bottles, though, if you want to get the good stuff, because they've been reformulated to shit. And I normally don't say that, right? That's not my thing. But for some reason, leather fragrances don't really make it through reformulation that well often. There's a few rare examples. Nietzsche 10 still smells amazing. Modern day bottles of Nietzsche 10 still smell very good. But a lot of these other ones, like English leather, didn't really survive. You want to get older bottles with those. So I'm not going to let you go buy something and steer you wrong and then have you cuss me out later, right? I'm not going to do that to you. So there are a few examples where I'm going to say, hey, get the older stuff, just because the newer stuff has not been curated very well. It hasn't been taken care of. In some cases it has. New bottles of Aramis smell pretty okay. Maybe not as good as the old stuff, but new bottles of Aramis still smell all right. Same thing with the Chanel Clé de Russie. That still smells okay too. You're going to pay arm and a leg for that because it's in their exclusive collection now. But again, you don't have to hunt down vintage for all of them. But some of them, like English leather, you really want to. Bellamy is kind of 50-50. You can keep or leave. Equipage, same thing, 50-50. You can get the new, you can get the old. I'm going to let you decide individually how you feel about those. But generally speaking, leather fragrances tend to be products of their time. And therefore, you want the examples from that time, if they're in good condition, to get the best snapshot of what that fragrance was trying to be, So anyhow, that's leather for you. The genre of leather. They are not all created equal. They are not all the same. So if you smell one and don't like it, don't assume you won't like another. And the bottom line here is that if you don't like the concept of smelling like leather, you don't want to go near any of these anyway. But at least you have some information to help you in your continued journey. This has been the Unlist. Hope you enjoyed it.